Clutched in her trembling hands was a heavy rusted iron box, the only thing her grandmother left her after 5 years of sleepless nights, soiled bed linens, and a youth she would never get back. Her family laughed. To them, it was the perfect final insult, a worthless lump of swamp-colored scrap handed to the girl who had given up everything while they walked away with mansions, diamonds, and millions. Della Wexford carried that box home on a crowded Philadelphia train, the rusted edges tearing at her cheap morning dress, her brother's mocking phone call still ringing in her ears. "There's nothing inside, Della. I'm the one who told her to give it to you." She almost threw it in the river. She was 28, broke 3 days from eviction, and certain she'd been betrayed by the one person she thought had loved her. Then she started scrubbing, just to see if the metal was worth a few dollars at the scrapyard. And what she uncovered beneath 70 years of grime would make the most ruthless antique dealer in the city lock his doors, draw the curtains, and break down in tears. Because the heaviest burden her family ever mocked her with was about to expose every lie they'd ever told and hand Della something worth more than all their millions combined. Stay with me. You will not believe how this one ends. The rusted iron box sat in her lap like a tombstone. Della Wexford held it against her chest as the train rattled through the dark underbelly of Philadelphia, and she could feel the cold of the metal soaking through the thin fabric of her dress. It was a cheap dress, a clearance rack dress, black, the kind you buy when someone dies and you have exactly $19 to spend on grief. The rust had already bitten into it, leaving long reddish-brown streaks down her ribs, like the box was trying to brand her, mark her, remind her of exactly what she was worth in the eyes of the people who shared her blood. Nothing. That was the answer the day had given her. After 5 years, after everything. She stared down at the thing in her arms. It was about the size of a toaster, but it weighed close to 20 pounds, and it looked like something dredged up from the bottom of a swamp. Blackened iron, patches of green corrosion. A primitive padlock fused shut with rust, hanging from the front clasp like a broken tooth. It was ugly. It was useless, and it was hers. A man across the aisle glanced at it, then at her tear-streaked face, then looked away the way people do when they sense a story they don't want to be part of. Della closed her eyes, and in the rocking dark of that train car, the last 5 years of her life played behind her eyelids like a film she could not stop. She had been 23 when it started. 23 and standing in the marble foyer of the Wexford estate, out on the main line, with an acceptance letter to a graduate program in architecture folded in her coat pocket, and a future that finally felt like it belonged to her. She had clawed her way to that letter. Late nights, 2 part-time jobs, a scholarship she'd fought for like a dog. Architecture had been the one thing in her life that was entirely her own. The one dream nobody in the family had handed her or could take away. And then the phone call came. Her grandmother had collapsed. The doctors used careful, gentle words that meant terrible things. The body was failing. The mind for now was sharp as a blade, but the road ahead was long and it only went one direction. Vivian Wexford was a formidable woman. Everyone said so, and they said it the way you describe whether you've survived. She had built an empire, shipping lines, warehouses, real estate that stretched from the Delaware riverfront to the towers of Manhattan. She had buried 2 husbands and outlasted every rival who ever underestimated her. She wore her wealth like armor and her opinions like weapons, and she did not suffer fools, cowards, or quitters. She was the most intimidating person Della had ever known. She was also, in those first frightened days, completely alone, because the rest of the family had a remarkable talent for vanishing. Della's older brother Royce was 36 and allergic to inconvenience. The moment the word dementia entered the conversation, the moment the future stopped looking like an inheritance and started looking like a burden. Royce relocated to a beach house on the Carolina coast. He called it grief. He said he simply could not bear to watch the great Vivian Wexford deteriorate, that it would break something in him to see her like that. What it actually broke was nothing. He sent flowers twice in 5 years. He never once held her hand. His wife, Adrienne, cited a delicate nervous condition that made hospitals and sick rooms impossible for her. The nervous condition never seemed to interfere with her schedule of charity galas, spa retreats, or the acquisition of jewelry the size of small fruit. She visited the estate exactly once during the entire ordeal, stayed 11 minutes, and complained the whole time about the smell. And their cousin, Hollis simply stopped answering the phone. So it fell to Della. It always falls to someone. The world runs on the quiet labor of the ones who show up. And Della showed up. She turned down the graduate program. She let the dream go without ceremony, folded that acceptance letter, and put it in a drawer where she would not have to look at it. And she moved into the cold cavern of the Wexford estate. She took the small room off the east wing, the one nearest her grandmother's, so she could hear when the night went wrong. And the night went wrong often. 5 years. 5 years of changing soiled linens at 3 in the morning, while the old woman wept with shame. 5 years of measuring out morphine drops with a hand that shook from exhaustion, but never ever from doubt. 5 years of bathing a body that had once commanded boardrooms, of feeding a woman who had once feasted with senators, of holding a frail and spotted hand through endless nights when the dementia finally came. And it did come in those last terrible months, stealing Vivian piece by piece until some days she did not know her own name, but she always knew Della's. Even at the very end, when the great mind had mostly gone dark, Vivian would surface sometimes, swim up out of the fog, and find Della's face, and her cracked lips would move. "You're still here?" she would whisper as if it astonished her. "I'm still here, Grandma." "They're not." "No, they're not." And the old woman would close her eyes and something would settle in her face. Not peace exactly, but something harder and more deliberate. Something that looked Della would only understand much later like a decision. There was a particular afternoon Della would never forget. It came early in the second year before The mind began to fail when Vivian was still herself, terrifyingly, completely herself. They were sitting in the conservatory, the winter light coming gray through the glass, and the old woman had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, out of nowhere, "Do you know how I tell what a person is truly worth, Della? How I watch them when they think no one is watching." Vivian turned her sharp eyes on her granddaughter. "Anyone can perform virtue at a funeral. Anyone can weep over a will. But character is what a person does in the dark, when there's no reward in it, when there's nothing to gain and no one to applaud." A long pause. "I have spent my whole life being lied to by people who wanted my money. I learned to see through them, every single one." She had reached over then and gripped Della's hand with surprising strength. "I have one more test left in me," she said. "One last test for all of them. And you, my girl, you're going to pass it without even knowing you're taking it." Della had laughed gently and told her not to talk like that. She had thought it was the rambling of a tired old woman. She had no idea. The train shuddered to a stop. Della opened her eyes. Her station. She gathered the heavy box against her body and stood, her arms already aching, and stepped out into the night. That had been today. The funeral had been 3 days ago. And the reading of the will, the reading that had carved her open in front of the only family she had left, that had been this very afternoon. She would carry that afternoon with her for the rest of her life. The law offices of Conrad Vane occupied the top floor of a stone building downtown, all dark wood and brass, and the smell of old money. Dust motes hung in the shafts of light coming through tall windows, and the air was thick with the particular silence of people waiting to learn how rich they were about to become. Della had arrived in her clearance rack dress and sat in a high-backed leather chair that swallowed her small frame. To her left, her brother Royce checked a watch that cost more than she'd earned in 5 years, sighing at the inconvenience of being made to wait for his fortune. Beside him, Adrian twisted a diamond ring around and around her manicured finger, bored beautiful and brittle. And leaning against a bookshelf near the back, scrolling through his phone, was Hollis, their cousin, present in body, absent in every way that mattered. Conrad Vane sat behind a desk the size of a dining table. He was a thin man with a face that had spent decades arranging itself into expressions of grave importance, and he wore a suit that whispered discretion and charged accordingly. He cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles, and lifted a thick cream-colored document. "If we are all settled," he said in a voice as dry as old paper, "I shall begin." What followed was a masterclass in unequal distribution. To Royce went the crown jewels of the estate. The sprawling mainline mansion with its 40 rooms and its acres of manicured grounds. The family's primary stock portfolio. And the commercial property in Manhattan, a tower in the financial district worth by itself more than most men see in 10 lifetimes. The total ran well past $40 million. And Della watched her brother's face the whole time. And she watched a smile spread across it that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with appetite. To Adrienne, who had spoken perhaps a dozen words to Vivian in 3 years, went the entire Wexford jewelry collection. Generations of it. Sapphires, emeralds, a parure of diamonds that had supposedly once belonged to European royalty. Adrienne actually gasped a small, greedy sound and pressed a hand to her chest as though overcome. To Hollis went a trust fund. Generous, comfortable, the kind of money that ensures a man never has to work a single day for the rest of his life. Hollis nodded as though it were no more than his due, and Della sat very still and waited and tried not to hope. She did not want millions. She wanted to be honest about that, even with herself sitting in that room. She did not want the mansion or the tower or the royal jewels. She had only ever hoped for enough to clear the crushing debt she'd buried herself in while living on a caregiver's stipend. Enough to finally pull that folded acceptance letter back out of the drawer and return to school. Enough to begin the life she'd put on a shelf at 23. That was all. That would have been everything. Conrad Vane's eyes moved down the page. He paused. Something flickered across his careful face. Della would remember that flicker later, would turn it over and over in her mind. And then he read aloud. And finally, to my granddaughter, Della, for her steadfast presence during my twilight years, I leave the contents of the safe in the eastern attic, specifically the iron strongbox and all the weight it represents. The room was silent for 1 full second. Then Royce laughed. It was a sharp, ugly bark of a laugh, and he leaned toward his wife and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "The attic! She's inheriting the attic! What's in there, the bats?" Adrienne laughed too, a tinkling little laugh, raising one hand to her mouth in mock apology. Hollis smirked at his phone, and Conrad Vane reached down behind his desk and with visible effort hoisted the box up onto the polished surface. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that rattled the pens in their cup. Della stared at it. It was hideous. There was no other word. It looked like a chunk of industrial wreckage that had been left out in the rain for a century. A blackened, misshapen lump of corroded iron streaked with green. The rusted padlock dangling uselessly from the front. It sat there among the gleaming antiques of the law office, like a dead thing dragged into a ballroom.
"Oh, Della," Adrienne cooed, recovering from her laughter. "How rustic. It really does suit
Your whole aesthetic, doesn't it? Grandmother always did have a wicked sense of humor," Roy said, rising and buttoning his bespoke jacket. He looked down at the box, then at his sister. "Well, it's fitting. You always were fond of spending time in the dust." He turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Vane, if we're finished, my broker is expecting my call." Della felt heat crawl up the back of her neck. Humiliation has a temperature. It burns, but she made herself stand. She made herself walk to the desk on legs that felt like lead. She placed her hands on the cold, rough surface of the box. The box in the metal was so cold, it almost felt wet, and she looked up at the lawyer. "Is there a key, Mr. Vane?" Her voice was soft, and she hated how it shook. The lawyer offered her a thin, fleeting smile that might have been pity. "I'm afraid not, Miss Wexford. Your grandmother delivered it to my care in precisely this condition 3 weeks before her passing. She left no key and no further instructions." He paused. "It's probably just full of old mothballs." From the back of the room, Hollis spoke without looking up. "I'd toss it in the river on the way home, Della. Save yourself the bus fare." Della did not look at any of them. She wrapped her arms around the box, hoisted it against her chest, and felt the rusted edge catch and tear the fabric of her cheap dress. Felt it scrape her ribs, and she lifted her chin and walked out of that room with her back straight and her eyes burning, refusing to let them see her cry. She had given that woman her youth, her energy, her education. In return, they had handed her a piece of rust while the vultures feasted on gold. That was hours ago. Now the train doors hissed shut behind her, and she climbed the stairs into the cold Philadelphia night, the box dragging at her arms, and she walked the 6 blocks to her apartment in Fishtown with the weight digging into her ribs the entire way. And by the time she reached her door,
her arms were trembling so badly, barely in the lawn.
Her apartment was one cramped room above a shuttered laundromat. It smelled of damp brick and the cheap ramen she'd been living on. The radiator clanked but produced no heat. She dropped the box onto her little chipped formica table with a crash that shook the whole apartment, and she sank into a wobbly chair, and finally alone with no one to see, she let herself cry. It was not the money. She kept telling herself that, and it kept being true, and it kept not mattering. It was the cruelty. It was the deliberate surgical cruelty of it. Vivian had known exactly what she was doing. The old woman did nothing by accident in her entire life. She had chosen to leave Della a piece of trash in front of everyone as her final word on the subject of what her granddaughter's devotion had been worth. And then Della's phone buzzed against the table. She wiped her eyes and looked at it. The screen glowed in the dim room. Royce. She almost didn't answer. Some animal part of her knew that nothing good had ever come down that particular line. But a darker curiosity won out a need to hear it, whatever it was, to swallow the last of the poison so it couldn't surprise her later, and she pressed the phone to her ear. "Did you make it home without pulling a muscle?" Her brother's voice was warm with satisfaction. "What do you want, Royce?" "Just a friendly check-in." A pause, and she could hear him smiling. "And a little brotherly advice. Don't waste your time trying to break that thing open. There's nothing inside." Della's breath went still. "And how would you know that?" "Because I'm the one who suggested she give it to you." The room seemed to tilt. What?
Oh, come on, Della. You didn't actually think your little Florence Nightingale routine fooled
Anybody, did you? His voice dripped with lazy contempt. 5 years of bedpans, and you thought what nobody could see what you were really angling for. Grandmother knew. She knew you were just camping out, waiting for the payday. So a few weeks before she died, in one of her clear spells, she asked me, point blank, what she ought to leave you. And I told her the truth. I said you were far too spiritual for cash, too pure for vulgar money. And then I reminded her of that hideous lump of scrap the gardeners dug up by the old carriage house years ago. You should have heard her laugh, Della. She laughed so hard she started coughing. We agreed it was the perfect metaphor for you. Heavy, burdensome, and completely worthless. Della could not speak. Enjoy your inheritance, sis, Roy said. And the line went dead. The phone slid out of her fingers and clattered onto the table. She sat frozen in the cold and the dark. And the very last thing she had been holding on to, crumbled to dust. Because up until that phone call, some small, foolish part of her had still believed in her grandmother. Had told herself there must be a reason, a misunderstanding, something. That the woman whose hand she'd held through 1,000 awful nights could not possibly have meant it as an insult. But it was worse than an insult. It was a collaboration. Her brother had built the joke, and her grandmother had laughed and signed it. She had loved a woman who at the very end had looked at 5 years of her granddaughter's life and decided it was funny. And now something began to change in Della. Slowly. The grief did not leave, but it was joined by something else. Something hot and hard and rising. Anger. A clean, burning anger that started in her chest and spread out through her arms. And she glared at the rusted box sitting on her table in the half-dark. And for one wild moment she wanted to pick it up and hurl it through the window to watch it shatter on the pavement below, to be rid of it forever. But she didn't, because she couldn't afford to. She picked up her phone again and opened her banking app, and the number that greeted her was the same number that had been greeting her for weeks. -$12. Her account was overdrawn by $12. Her rent was due in 3 days. Her credit cards were maxed to the limit, maxed out paying for her own health insurance during the years she'd been unemployed and uninsured, taking care of a woman who was apparently laughing at her behind a curtain of dementia. She had nothing. And there on her table sat 20 pounds of metal. Maybe the thought arrived cold and practical. Maybe the metal itself was worth something. It was heavy, unusually heavy. Maybe under all that rust it was solid brass, and brass had value, you could scrap brass. Or maybe it was just an old iron antique that some eccentric collector would pay $100 for novelty value, nothing more. $100. $100 meant groceries. $100 meant she could breathe for 1 more week. She got up. She went to the kitchen sink and found her supplies: an old toothbrush worn flat, a box of baking soda, and a bottle of the harsh chemical cleaner she used on the oven, the kind that made you open a window. She carried them back to the table, sat down in front of the ugly box, and she began to scrub. For 20 minutes, the grime fought her. It came off in greasy black flakes that smelled of age and rot, sticking under her fingernails, smearing across the formica. The corrosion was thick, decades, thick generations, thick, and it resisted everything she threw at it. Her arm began to ache. Her shoulder burned. But she kept going because anger is fuel, and she had a great deal of anger now, and every stroke of that toothbrush was an argument she was having with her dead grandmother. You laughed at me. Scrub. I held your hand. Scrub. I gave you everything. Scrub. She worked her way toward the front of the box, toward the area just above the rusted padlock. And there, the chemical finally won it, ate through a stubborn black crust, and the crust lifted away in a single flake. And Della stopped. She stopped because the metal underneath was wrong. It wasn't brass. Brass was yellow golden warm. And it wasn't iron gray and dull and pitted. What gleamed up at her from beneath the grime in a small cleared patch no bigger than a thumbnail was a strange grayish white metal, heavy-looking dense, with a deep cold luster that did not look like silver and did not tarnish like silver, a metal she had no name for. She wiped at it with her thumb. The patch grew. The light from her bare overhead bulb caught it, and the metal seemed to drink the light and hold it. And then she saw something else. Stamped into that small cleared section of strange gray metal was an engraving. It was tiny, microscopic, almost and impossibly fine. The kind of work no machine in this world could do, the kind of work that takes a human being with steady hands and a magnifying glass and an entire lifetime of skill. She leaned in close, holding her breath. It was a crest. A double-headed eagle wings spread, clashing with a winged serpent. The two of them locked in struggle, encircled by a ring of thorns. Every feather, every scale, every individual thorn rendered in lines finer than a hair. And below the crest, deeply etched into the metal, were 3 letters. F, G, B. Della stared at them. They meant nothing to her. 3 letters, a strange beast, a primitive box. None of it made sense. A piece of industrial scrap dug up by gardeners near a carriage house did not carry engravings like the inside of a Swiss watch. She sat back. Her heart was doing something strange in her chest, an irregular fluttering thing. Why would anyone hide a mark like that under 100 years of deliberate grime? And there it was. The word arrived in her mind and would not leave. Deliberate. The rust wasn't just neglect. There was something underneath it. Something that someone a very long time ago had not wanted the world to see. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the cold, staring at the ceiling, and the box sat on the table, watching her in the dark. And her mind would not stop circling the crest. the letters, the metal that wasn't metal she knew. Royce's voice. There's nothing inside, her grandmother's laugh. And underneath all of it, faint but insistent, that strange afternoon in the conservatory. I have one more test left in me. One last test for all of them. And you're going to pass it without even knowing you're taking it. Toward dawn, exhausted, half dreaming, Della had a thought that made her sit straight up in bed. What if the box wasn't the joke? What if the box was the message? She got up. The apartment was freezing. She crossed to the table and turned on the lamp and looked at the thing again. Really looked at it the way she'd been trained to look at structures, at buildings, at how things were made and joined and hidden. Because before she gave up on architecture, she had been good at it, very good. She knew how to read an object. She knew that real things have logic, that nothing is shaped the way it is by accident. And this box, this hideous box, had something wrong with its proportions. She ran her fingers along the edges. The exterior dimensions were larger than they should be for a box this size. The walls were too thick, far too thick. A normal strong box has walls maybe a 1/4 inch deep. These felt closer to 2 inches. Either the entire thing was solid with almost no interior at all, which would explain the impossible weight, or there was something between the walls. A hidden space. Her hands started to shake. She pressed and prodded along every seam, every joint, every rusted rivet, looking for the thing she knew had to be there. The padlock was a decoy. She understood that now it was fused shut and went nowhere. The real mechanism would be hidden in plain sight, disguised as part of the corrosion. For nearly an hour she searched, and just as her frustration was peaking, just as she was about to give up and admit she was a desperate woman inventing meaning out of rust, her thumb caught on something near the bottom edge, a piece of rusted brass shaped like a rivet, except it gave when she pressed it. Just slightly. A fraction of an inch. She pressed harder. Click. The sound was tiny and clean and utterly out of place in that decrepit object, the sound of a precision mechanism, a century old, still doing exactly what it was built to do. A small panel along the lower edge of the box slid sideways, grinding, releasing a shower of rust flakes onto the table. And behind the panel was a narrow compartment. Della's breath stopped. There was no diamond, no gold, no fortune. The little hidden space was barely large enough to hold what was inside it. A single object wrapped in oilcloth so it would survive the years. Her fingers, trembling, reached in and drew it out and unwrapped the cloth with the care of a person defusing a bomb. It was a letter, a folded sheet of heavy cream stationery, the same kind that had carried the words of the will sealed with a circle of dark red wax pressed with the Wexford family crest. And across the front, in handwriting, Della would have known anywhere, sharp, elegant, imperious, The handwriting of a woman who had signed orders that moved ships across oceans was a single word: Della. Her hands shook so badly she nearly tore it. She broke the wax. She unfolded the page, and in the gray light of dawn in her cold apartment above the shuttered laundromat, $12 overdrawn and 3 days from the street, Della Wexford read the words her grandmother had left for her alone. My dearest Della, if you are reading this, then it means two things. It means you did not throw away a heavy, ugly burden simply because the world told you it was worthless. And it means they have all done exactly what I knew they would do. I am writing this while my mind is still entirely my own. Remember that no matter what they say to you later, whatever else this disease takes from me, it did not take this. I am clear. I am deliberate. And every word here is by my own choice. I know what you have done for me, my girl. I know the nights. I know the years. I know what you gave up. And I know that you never once asked me for a single thing in return. Do you understand how rare that is? In my entire life, I have perhaps 3 people who would do what you have done. And I married one of them and buried him, and the other 2 are dead. And now there is only you. I let them believe they had won. I let your brother believe he was orchestrating a grand humiliation. I even let him think the cruelty was his idea. It was the only way to be certain the truth would pass to the one person on this earth worthy of protecting it. But understand me, Della, you are not yet safe. The moment they realize what you are holding, they will come for it. They will come for it with lawyers and lies. And there is one among them who is not what he appears to be. Trust no one in this family. Do you hear me? No one. There is only one man you can go to. Take the box. Take it exactly as it is. Do not let anyone else touch it. And find Edmund Hartley. He alone knows what you carry, and he alone can prove it. Tell no one where you are going. Speak to no one until you have spoken to him. The weight you have been carrying, my darling girl, was never a burden. It was a key. Go now, and be careful. They are already watching. With all my love and all my faith. Grandmother. Della sat in the cold, the letter trembling in her hands, and outside the window, the first gray light of morning was breaking over the rooftops of a sleeping city. And in that moment, every single thing she thought she knew turned inside out. The cruelty had been a costume. The insult had been a shield. The laughter her brother had described, she laughed so hard she coughed. Della understood now exactly what her grandmother had been laughing at. She had not been laughing at Della. She had been laughing at them. The whole thing was a trap baited with their own greed, set with surgical patience by a dying woman who had spent her entire life learning to see straight through people, and who had spent her last clear days building one final test. And Della, without ever knowing, it had already passed it. By staying, by carrying, by scrubbing the rust off a thing everyone told her to throw in the river. You're going to pass it without even knowing you're taking it. Della pressed the letter to her chest and looked at the rusted box on her table, and it was not ugly anymore. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. But the letter's warning had wrapped a cold hand around her heart, and it would not let go. Trust no one in this family. One among them is not what he appears to be. They are already watching. She thought of Royce's gloating phone call. She thought of Adrian's diamonds. She thought of Hollis scrolling on his phone, telling her to throw it in the river. She thought of Conrad Vane and that strange flicker on his careful face when he read her name from the will. And she thought of a stranger's name, a name she had never heard before in her life, written in her grandmother's own hand as the only safe harbor in a sea full of sharks. Edmund Lee. Della stood up. Her legs were steady now. The fear was still there, would be there for a long time, but something else had moved in alongside it. Something that had been beaten flat for 5 years and was now slowly beginning to rise. She wrapped the heavy box in an old bath towel, the strange gray crest disappearing under the cloth, and she lowered it into a canvas tote bag. She put on her coat over her rust-stained dress. She slid the letter into her inside pocket against her heart, where no hand but hers could reach it. She did not know what she was carrying. She did not know what the crest meant, or the 3 letters, or why a master craftsman would hide a fortune inside a lie. But she knew this much. For 5 years, her family had looked at her and seen nothing. They had handed her a burden and laughed and turned their backs, so certain of her worthlessness that they never once thought to look closely at the thing they were throwing away. That was about to become the most expensive mistake any of them had ever made. Della Wexford lifted the tote bag, felt the full impossible weight of it settle against her hip, and walked out the door into the rising morning and toward a truth that would bring an entire family of vultures to their knees. She just didn't know yet how far they would go to stop her. The name Edmund Hartley led her to Walnut Street. It took Della most of that gray morning to find him. She had no money for a phone search beyond what little data she had left, and so she'd done it the old way. A payphone she didn't think still existed, a torn page from a public library directory, a long cold walk through the waking city with 20 pounds of platinum dragging at her shoulder. And at the end of it all, tucked between a shuttered jeweler and a boutique that sold handbags worth more than her annual income, she found a narrow storefront of dark green and polished brass. Hartley and Associates, fine antiquities, by appointment. It was the kind of place that did not want her. She could feel it from the sidewalk. The kind of place where the door is heavy on purpose, where the lighting is calibrated to make objects look priceless and people look small. Della stood outside it in her rust-stained dress, her hair unwashed, her eyes ringed with the dark of a sleepless night, and she nearly turned around. Then she remembered her grandmother's hand gripping hers in the conservatory. She remembered the letter against her heart. She pushed the door open. A bell chimed somewhere deep inside, a single soft, melodic note. The air that met her was climate-controlled and rich, the smell of beeswax and lemon oil and old paper, the smell of careful things kept carefully. Glass cases lined the walls, and inside them gleamed pocket watches and illuminated manuscripts and porcelain, so fine it looked like frozen milk. Everything in the room cost more than Della's life had been worth in dollars for the past 5 years. And behind the main counter, a tall, lean man looked up from a ledger. He was perhaps 58, with silver at his temples and a pristine tweed waistcoat and a pair of gold-rimmed glasses perched on a nose built for looking down. His eyes moved over her in a single practiced sweep. The cheap dress, the rust stains, the unwashed hair, the bulging canvas bag, and his face arranged itself into an expression of polite glacial contempt. This, she understood at once, was a man who had built his entire life on the difference between things that mattered and things that didn't. And he had already decided which category she fell into. "Can I help you?" His voice was cool and precise. "If you're looking for the subway, it's 2 blocks down and to the left." Della set her jaw. She walked to the counter and lifted the heavy canvas bag up onto the glass, and the man, Edmund Hartley, it had to be, winced visibly, his hands twitching toward the priceless case as though to protect it from her. I'm not looking for the subway," she said. "I need an appraisal, or at the very least I need to know if it's worth anything as scrap." Edmund Hartley let out a long theatrical sigh. He removed his glasses, polished them on a cloth, and replaced them. And the whole performance was designed to communicate exactly how much of his time she was wasting. "Miss," he said, "Wexford, Della Wexford." Something passed across his face when she said the name. It was very small, and it was gone almost before it arrived. But she caught it, a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, the look of a man who has just heard a word he wasn't expecting to hear. Then it was gone, and the contempt slid back into place like a curtain falling.
"Miss Wexford," he continued, "this is a house of fine antiquities. We are not a pawn shop. We are not a salvage operation. Whatever industrial wreckage you have brought me in that bag, I assure you it belongs in a yard somewhere south of the river, not on my counter. I'll thank you to remove it."
"Please." Della heard her own voice crack, and she hated it, but she was too tired and too desperate to hide it anymore. "Just look at it. 10 seconds. My family gave it to me as a joke. They laughed at me, all of them, and I need to know if it's completely worthless before I let them be right about me. 10 seconds." Please. Something in her voice stopped him. Maybe it was the rawness of it. Maybe a man who spends his life among objects forgets sometimes what a human being in genuine distress sounds like. And the sound, when it comes, lands harder than any polished argument. Edmund Hartley studied her exhausted face for a long moment, and the contempt in his expression flickered just slightly into something more uncertain.
10 seconds, he said curtly, and then you leave. I have serious clients arriving within the hour.
Della pulled the towel back. The box sat there on the immaculate glass under the brilliant halogen lights, and somehow it looked even worse in this setting than it had on her kitchen table. A blackened, rusted, swamp-colored lump, an obscenity in a temple of beauty. Edmund did not even lean in.
It's a carriage strong box, he pronounced. Mid-19th century, most likely. Mass-produced. Worth, I'm afraid, exactly nothing. Now, please.
Wait! Della turned the box, exposing the small patch she had scrubbed clean the night before the gray gleam, the impossible engraving. Here, look at this. There's a mark. Edmund Hartley rolled his eyes. But he was a professional, and a professional cannot quite help himself when a mark is mentioned. And so, with the air of a man humoring a child, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a jeweler's loop. He fitted it to his right eye. He leaned over the counter, intending Della could see it, to glance at the thing for half a second and then dismiss her forever. He brought his face close to the cleared metal, and he stopped breathing. Della watched it happen. She watched the great antique dealer go absolutely still, his nose mere inches from the gray patch, the loop pressed to his eye. And for one long, agonizing moment, the entire shop fell silent, but for the slow tick of a grandfather clock somewhere in the back. Slowly, Edmund Hartley reached out one trembling finger. He traced the microscopic shape of the eagle and the serpent. He traced the ring of thorns. And then, very lightly, the 3 letters etched beneath. FB. When he finally pulled his head back from the loop, his face had drained of all its color. The arrogance was simply gone, wiped clean, as though it had never been there at all. His hands, which had rested so casually on the glass a moment before, now gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. He looked like a man who had seen something he had spent his whole life believing he would never see. He reached under the counter without looking, his eyes never leaving the box, and brought up a small dropper bottle of clear solvent and a folded square of microfiber cloth. His 10 seconds and his serious clients were entirely forgotten. With the care of a surgeon, he placed a single drop of solvent on the gray metal and drew the cloth across it. The patch came alive. Not silver, not steel, something deeper, heavier, a luster like moonlight given mass, a metal that held the light the way still water holds the sky. Dear God, Edmund Hartley whispered. The loop fell from his eye and clattered against the glass. He looked up at Della, and to her absolute astonishment, his eyes were wet. As she watched, a single tear broke loose and traced a line down his pale cheek and fell silently onto the glass between them.
Miss Wexford.
His voice was hoarse, stripped of every trace of the man who had told her to find the subway. It shook.
Where in God's name did you get this?
Della's heart was slamming against her ribs.
My grandmother left it to me,
she said, in her will, as a joke. She swallowed. Mr. Hartley, what is it? What does FGB mean? For a long moment, he didn't answer. He simply stared at her and at the box, as if he could not make the two of them coexist in the same reality. Then he moved. He crossed the room with quick, decisive steps, flipped the sign on his front door to closed, and turned the deadbolt with a heavy clunk. He drew the velvet curtains across the front windows, and the bright shop dimmed into a hushed amber gloom lit only by the glow of the display cases. When he turned back to her, he was a different man, entirely younger, somehow electric, alive, with something that looked almost like terror and almost like joy.
Miss Wexford, he said. For the last 70 years, every serious historian and gemologist on 3 continents has believed this object was lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
Della stared at him. You asked if the metal was or iron. It is neither. He drew a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might be listening. This entire box, this casting, weighing some 20 pounds, is solid, unalloyed platinum. The word landed in Della's chest like a stone dropped into a well. Platinum. Her knees went soft. She gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright. She knew enough, even in her ignorance, to know what platinum cost. 20 pounds of solid platinum. The raw metal alone. The metal she had nearly thrown in the river. The metal her cousin had told her to toss to save bus fare. The raw metal alone was worth a fortune. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. More. But Edmund Hartley was not finished. He held up a hand as if to say, that is nothing, that is the least of it. And the metal, he said, is merely the canvas. He hurried to a tall oak cabinet at the back of the shop and pulled out a heavy leather-bound volume. The kind of reference book that costs as much as a car. And he flipped through its glossy pages with shaking fingers until he found what he was looking for. He turned the book around on the counter and laid it before her. On the page was a faded photograph of a seal, the double-headed eagle, the winged serpent, the ring of thorns, the exact crest Della had uncovered beneath a century of grime. FGB, Edmund said, tapping the page with reverence, stands for Fenwick Galloway Beaumont. He let the name hang in the amber air. I was a master jeweler and metal worker. A genius, the kind that comes perhaps twice in a century. A contemporary and a rival of the great houses of his age, and in many ways their superior, though he hated fame and worked almost entirely in secret. He made objects for kings he never met and titans he never named. Edmund's eyes lifted to hers, and in the early part of the last century, he received a single extraordinary commission from a fiercely private American industrialist, a man so secretive his name was never recorded, a man rumored to have been a silent partner of the great financiers of his day. What was the commission?
An impenetrable vault, Edmund said, but not a vault of steel and locks. Anyone can build that. No, this man needed to move something of impossible world-altering value across an ocean through ports crawling with thieves and customs men and spies without a single soul ever suspecting what he carried. A thin, odd smile crossed his face. So Beaumont gave him the greatest disguise ever conceived. He cast the vault in solid platinum, the rarest, most precious metal on earth, and then he coated it. He developed a special compound, a hardened iron oxide shell, and he laid it over the platinum by hand, layer on layer, until the most valuable container ever made looked like a worthless lump of rusted industrial scrap. Della looked down at the hideous box on the counter, and she understood. So that thieves, she said slowly, would look right at it and see nothing, Edmund finished. See garbage, see a thing to be stepped over, the perfect camouflage, treasure hiding inside its own ugliness. He shook his head, marveling. It was insured by Lloyd's of London. It crossed the Atlantic, and then, somewhere, sometime in the chaos of the last 100 years, it simply vanished. The Beaumont strong box. Auction houses have kept standing bounties
For any word of it, for 40 years, there are museums with empty plinths waiting.
He looked at her, and there was something almost frightened in his face. And it has been sitting in your grandmother's attic, gathering dust. Della's mind was reeling, but one thread held steady through the storm. One fact that suddenly clicked into terrible, beautiful sense. My grandfather, she said. He was a shipping magnate in the 20s. He worked with the big financiers. Everyone knew it. It's how the family started. Edmund went very still. Then it isn't lost at all, he breathed. It was never lost. It went home with the man who commissioned it, and it stayed in his family, and his family forgot what it was. He pressed a hand to his mouth. Miss Wexford, the box is extraordinary. The box alone would make headlines around the world. But you must understand, the box was only ever the vessel. His eyes burned into hers. Do you have any idea what is inside it? No. Della's voice was barely a whisper. There's no key. The lawyer said there was no key. And to her astonishment, Edmund Hartley laughed a short, breathless, delighted sound. Of course there's no key, he said. Beaumont despised keys. A key can be stolen. A key can be copied. A key tells the world there is something worth locking. He shook his head in wonder. No. He built puzzles, mechanical riddles hidden in the geometry of the object itself. If you do not know the box does not open. It will sit there mute and ugly until the end of time. He pulled a pair of pristine white cotton gloves from a drawer and worked them onto his hands. And as it happens, he said quietly, I know this box. He moved to it. He laid his gloved hands on the rusted, soot-blackened lid, and he closed his eyes for a moment like a pianist before the first note. Then he began. The schematics survived, he murmured as he worked. Not the box, but the drawings in the archives of Lloyd's filed for the insurance. I studied them for years. I never thought. He pressed firmly on the front left corner. Click. He slid his thumb down the side against what looked like a simple rusted rivet and pushed. A second click, deeper mechanical. He repeated the sequence on the right side, his face tight with concentration, and then he placed 3 fingers at the base of the fused, useless padlock and pressed. For a moment, nothing. Then, with a low, grinding sound and a final shower of rust, the entire front face of the box dropped, not open, but downward, half an inch, revealing a seam that had been invisible a moment before. Edmund Hartley let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 30 years, and with both hands with infinite care, he lifted the heavy platinum lid. Della leaned in. The inside of the box was nothing like the outside. Where the exterior was wrought and ruined, the interior was perfection, lined in midnight blue velvet, deep and soft, and entirely untouched by the century that had passed, as fresh as the day it was made. And nestled in that velvet were 3 things. A heavy pouch woven of what looked like spun gold thread. A thick stack of documents, cream-colored, edged in faded ink-bearer bonds. Della would learn, though she did not know the word yet. And a flat packet sealed in wax bearing the Wexford crest. But it was the pouch that Edmund reached for first with hands that had begun to tremble again. He drew it out. He untied the silk cord at its throat. And he tipped its contents gently onto a square of black velvet he laid upon the glass. The light in the room caught fire. Della heard herself gasp. Resting on the dark fabric was a necklace, and the word necklace was a crime against what lay before her. It was an arrangement of flawless cushion-cut diamonds, but they were not white, they were pink, a soft and impossible rose. Dozens of them, graduating in size, and at the center hung a single stone, the size of a quail's egg, blazing with a deep magenta fire that seemed to come from somewhere inside it, somewhere that had nothing to do with the lights overhead. Edmund Hartley made a sound she had never heard a grown man make. He staggered backward and caught himself against a display case. The Beaumont rose, he choked. The what? The centerpiece of his life's work. The stone he set into his masterpiece. Edmund's voice broke. The necklace was insured by Lloyd's of London in 1922 for $4 million. $4 million a century ago. He looked at her, and his wet eyes were enormous. Today, Miss Wexford, that necklace it is not a matter of price anymore. It is beyond price. At auction, with its provenance, with its story, $80 million. 100. There is no ceiling. There is no comparison. It is one of the rarest objects ever to exist on this earth. And it has been sitting in your grandmother's attic inside a box your brother told you to throw in the river. He looked at the bonds. He looked at the platinum. He looked back at her, and his face was the face of a man trying to comprehend something too large for the human mind.
You are sitting, he said softly, on one of the greatest private fortunes in American history.
But Della was not looking at the diamonds. She was looking at the wax-sealed packet, the one with the Wexford crest, and her hand was already reaching for it. Because she understood now, she understood with absolute certainty that the diamonds were not the point. Her grandmother had not built this whole elaborate trap, had not orchestrated a 5-year test and a fake humiliation and a secret letter simply to hand her a necklace. The diamonds were the bait. The packet was the message. She broke the seal. Inside were documents, dense, legal, official looking, far too many of them for her to read in that moment, and clipped to the front a second note in her grandmother's hand. She read only the first lines, and her blood went cold. Della, by the time you read this, you will know what the necklace is worth. Forget it. It is the smallest part of what I have left you, and the loudest. Let them see it. Let them fight over it. While they are busy clawing at the diamonds, you will hold the thing that actually matters, and they will never even think to look. But you must move quickly, and you must move carefully. The vultures are circling already, and one of them is closer than you think. Della looked up. Mr. Hartley, she said, there's something you should know. My grandmother, she didn't send me here by accident. Edmund Hartley went very still. She told me to find you, Della said. By name, in a letter. She said you were the only man who could prove what this is. She said you would know. For a long moment, the old dealer did not speak. And then slowly the last of his professional composure fell away, and what was left underneath was simply an old man with wet eyes and a long memory. I knew Vivian Wexford, he said quietly, a very long time ago, before either of us was what we are now. He looked away at the curtained windows, at something Della could not see. She came to me once more than 5 years ago, before the illness took hold, when she was still entirely herself, still sharp as a saber. She brought me half of a dossier. Authentication papers, provenance, records, the photographs from Lloyd's, all of it. She made me swear to keep it sealed and to tell no one I had it. She said that one day someone might come to me carrying the other half of the story. His eyes found Della's. And that if they did, if they ever did, I was to help them and ask no questions and trust no one, but the person standing in front of me. A faint, sad smile. I always wondered if she was simply an eccentric old woman indulging a fantasy. I see now that she was the sanest person I have ever met. She knew. 5 years ago, she knew exactly how this would unfold, down to the day you would walk through my door. Della felt tears prick at her eyes, not of grief now, but of something almost too large to name. Because here was the proof, finally, of what the letter had told her. Her grandmother had not been cruel. Her grandmother had been a chess player moving pieces across 5 years and an entire family. And Della had not been the pawn she'd believed herself to be. She had been the queen held back hidden until the very last move. Then you can prove it, Della said. All of it. The box, the necklace, that it's real, that it's hers, that it's mine. I can prove it, Edmund said. My half and her half joined together. There is no court on earth that could deny it. He paused. But Miss Wexford, a fortune like this does not stay quiet. Authentication means contacting the auction houses. It means experts, insurers, documentation. The moment I begin that process, word will move through certain circles faster than light. People will know. And from what your grandmother seems to have understood about your family, they'll come for it, Della said. They will come for it, Edmund agreed grimly. And it was at that exact moment that the bell above the locked front door chimed. Both of them turned. A man stood just inside the doorway. Edmund had not locked it as thoroughly as he'd thought, or the man had simply tried the handle at the wrong moment. He was perhaps 60, immaculately dressed, in a charcoal overcoat, silver-haired, with the easy, predatory smile of a man who has never once been told no. His eyes went immediately hungrily to the black velvet on the counter and the rose-colored fire upon it. Forgive the intrusion, the man said smoothly, stepping inside as though invited. The sign said closed, but the door was kind enough to disagree. His smile widened. Reston Crane, I collect. And I could not help but notice you have something on that counter that I have quite literally dreamed about. Edmund moved instantly to put himself between the man and the necklace. We're closed, Mr. Crane. Are you? Crane's eyes never left the diamonds. He took another step. I'll come to the point. Because men like us value time. I know what that is. I've known it was real for 30 years, the rumors, the whispers, the Beaumont Rose surfacing somewhere on the East Coast. Have resources you cannot imagine. Now his gaze slid finally to Della. And you, I take it, are the seller, the owner. Della said nothing. I'll make this simple, Crane said, and his voice dropped into something low and intimate and dangerous. No auction, no documentation, no lawyers, no headlines, no taxes, no questions. We'll write you a check right here, right now, for a number that will end your every worry for the rest of your life. You are clearly a woman who has known hardships. His eyes flicked over her dress, the rest the exhaustion.
No one ever needs to know it existed.
He spread his hands.
Wire transfer in the morning. You walk out of this shop a wealthy woman with no complications. What do you say?
The shop was silent, and Della understood with sudden clarity exactly what was being offered to her.
A way out. A clean, immediate, painless way out. A number that would clear her debt and her rent and her overdrawn account and the ruin of the last 5 years all at once tonight without a fight. No courts. No family. No risk. Just take the check and run. It would have been so easy.
She thought about it. She was honest enough with herself in that moment to admit that she thought about it. 28 years old, $12 overdrawn. 3 days from the street. A man offering to make it all stop, but a sale with no documentation was a sale with no provenance. A treasure of this magnitude sold in the dark, off the books, to a man who insisted on no paper. Della might not have known the antiques trade, but she had spent 5 years watching her grandmother do business, and she knew what a deal that hides from the light is worth. Such a sale would be impossible to ever prove she had made honestly. It would leave her with no record that the necklace had ever been hers. No defense if the family came calling, nothing but a check from a stranger and a story no one would believe. And worse, far worse, it would mean handing the Beaumont rose, an object that belonged in the light of history, to a man who wanted it precisely because it could disappear. And underneath all of that, quieter and harder, was her grandmother's voice. Character is what a person does in the dark when there's no reward in it. She had stayed for 5 years when no one was watching. She was not going to sell her soul now just because someone had finally turned on the lights. No, Della said. Reston Crane's smile froze. I beg your pardon. I said no. Della's voice was quiet, but it did not shake. I'm not selling it to you. Not tonight, not in the dark, not off the books. If this is what you say it is, then it deserves to be authenticated properly in the open with every piece of paper a thing like this should have. And if you want it after that, you can bid for it like everyone else. Crane studied her for a long moment, and the warmth drained entirely out of his face, leaving something colder and far more honest underneath. You're making a mistake, miss. Wexford, she said. And I don't think I am. Crane buttoned his overcoat. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, and his parting smile was thin and unpleasant.
A great many people are
Going to want what you're holding, he said. You should be very careful who you trust. The ones who come at you smiling are rarely the dangerous ones. And then he was gone, the bell chiming behind him and the locked door swinging shut. Edmund Hartley let out a long breath. That, he said, was either the wisest thing I have ever seen a person do or the most foolish. I'm honestly not yet certain which. But there was a new respect in his eyes when he looked at her. Your grandmother chose well. The next 48 hours moved like a fever dream. Edmund worked quietly and carefully, exactly as he'd promised. He reunited his half of the dossier with the documents from the box. He photographed the necklace under controlled light, the platinum under magnification, every microscopic crest and maker's mark. He made discreet calls to a contact at one of the great auction houses, an old colleague. He trusted a man who specialized in the authentication of the impossible. And word, despite all their caution, began to move. It always does. Della stayed in a modest hotel near the shop, paid for by a small advance. Edmund arranged against the eventual sale, and for the first time in 5 years she slept in a bed that was hers, in a room that was warm. She read and reread the documents from the box late into the night, though much of the legal language swam past her. She read her grandmother's notes until she'd memorized them, and she waited for the trap to close, not her trap now, but the one she could feel forming around her, the one her grandmother had warned her about. It closed on a Friday. She was in Edmund's shop when his phone rang. She watched his face change as he listened, watched the color drain out of it, watched his jaw tighten, watched him set the phone down with the careful slowness of a man receiving bad news. "What is it?" Della asked.
The auction house, Edmund said quietly. Their legal department was contacted this morning by a firm representing the Wexford estate. He looked at her. Your family has filed an emergency injunction to freeze the sale. To
Freeze everything, the necklace, the box, all of it. Della's stomach dropped. On what grounds?
On the grounds, Edmund said, that your grandmother was not of sound mind when she made the bequest,
That she suffered from advanced dementia and could not possibly have understood what was contained in that box. His mouth was a thin line. They are claiming the contents belong not to you, but to the primary estate, which was awarded to Royce. Della breathed. To Royce. And there it was, exactly as the letter had promised. The moment they realize what you are holding, they will come for it, with lawyers and lies. They had seen the diamonds. Somehow they had learned about the diamonds. The word had reached them, and now they would tear her grandmother's memory apart in open court paint Vivian Wexford as a senile old woman who didn't know what she was signing, all to pry the Beaumont rose out of Della's hands. How did they even find out? Della said, and her voice rose despite herself. We were so careful. Almost no one knew. How could they possibly? And then she stopped, because there was one more thing she hadn't told Edmund. One small thing she'd dismissed at the time, in her loneliest moment 3 days ago, before the letter changed everything, when she'd still believed she was carrying nothing but a humiliating lump of rust. She had received a phone call. Not from Royce, not from Adrienne, from Hollis, their cousin, the one who'd told her to throw the box in the river. Except that on the phone, Hollis had been kind, gentle. He had called to apologize, he said, for the family's behavior at the reading. He'd said he was ashamed of how they'd treated her. He'd said he of all of them knew how hard she'd worked. that he saw her, that if she ever needed anything at all, she could come to him. He was the only one, he'd said, who was actually on her side. And in her loneliness and her hurt, she had let herself believe him. Just a little. She had told him she was looking into the box, that maybe there was something to it after all, that she'd found an old crest and was getting it looked at by a dealer in the city. She hadn't told him the dealer's name. She hadn't told him about the platinum or the diamonds or the letter. But she had told him enough. Della felt the blood leave her face. "Mr. Hartley," she said slowly, and the words tasted like ash. "I think I know how they found out." Across the city, in a sleek high-rise office she would not see until it was nearly too late. Della's family was already gathering Royce and his appetite, Adrienne and her panic, the corrupt lawyer, Conrad Vane, and the secrets he had buried, and one more smiling and patient who had played the part of the only friend she had left. The injunction was just the beginning, and as the court froze every asset and locked the Beaumont Rose away in an evidence vault she could no longer reach, Della Wexford stood in the dim amber light of the antique shop and realized that the easy part was over. She had found the treasure. Now she would have to fight for it against people who shared her blood, who knew exactly where she was weak, and who would burn her grandmother's good name to ash to take what was hers. She just didn't yet know that the most painful betrayal of all was the one she had already let through her own front door. The betrayal had a face, and Della knew it now. She sat in the dim amber light of Edmund Hartley's shop with the dead weight of understanding settling into her chest, and she made herself say it out loud, because saying a thing out loud is the only way to be sure you have stopped lying to yourself. It was Hollis. Edmund looked at her. "My cousin. He called me 3 days ago, before any of this, before I even opened the box." Della's hands had gone cold. "He was kind to me. Do you understand what that means, Mr. Hartley? In 5 years, no one in that family was ever kind to me. And the one time it finally happened, the one time someone said, 'I see you. I'm on your side.' I believed it. I was so starved for it that I told him. Not everything, but enough. I told him there was I told him I was bringing it to a dealer in the city to be looked at." She closed her eyes. "He played the only card that could have worked on me. He played kindness. He fed it to your brother," Edmund said quietly. "He fed it to my brother." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner. And then Della did something that surprised them both. She laughed, a short, broken, exhausted sound, but a real one. "My grandmother warned me," she said. "In the letter, trust no one in this family. One among them is not what he appears to be." And I read those words, and I carried that letter against my heart, and I still let him in. She shook her head. She knew. She knew which one it would be. She probably knew before I was born.
Then she also knew. Edmund said that you would need a way to fight back. Vivian Wexford did not build a trap with no exit for the one person she trusted to spring it. Della. He leaned toward her across the counter. She
Gave you the diamonds to be seen. You told me yourself her note said the necklace was the loudest part, the smallest part. Let them fight over the diamonds, she wrote. While they claw at the bait, you hold the thing that actually matters. His eyes were sharp now, the dealer's mind fully awake. I think it is time we stopped staring at the necklace and started reading the rest of what was in that box. Della had read those documents a dozen times in her hotel room and understood perhaps a tenth of them. But she had not read them with Edmund Hartley beside her, and she had not read them looking for a weapon. They spread the contents of the wax-sealed packet across the glass counter under the bright lamp. The bonds, the dense legal pages, and her grandmother's second note, the one Della had only skimmed in the shock of the moment. This time, she read every word. Della, by now they have come for you. They will say I was mad. They will say I did not know my own mind. Let them say it. I prepared for this the day I prepared everything else, which is to say 5 years ago, while my mind was a blade and witnessed by men who will swear to it. Go to the firm of Marbury and Stone in the city. Ask for the senior partner. Give her the reference number written below. She does not know your face, but she knows this number, and she has been waiting for it for 5 years, the same as Edmund. Everything you need to break them is already in place. I did not leave you a fight you could lose. I left you a fight that was over before it began. You only have to walk in and finish it. And when you have finished it, when you understand what they truly inherited and what you truly hold, remember that the heaviest thing in that box was never the platinum. It was my faith in you. Carry that too. It weighs nothing, and it is worth everything. Beneath the words was a long string of numbers and a name.
Marbury and Stone, Edmund murmured. That's no estate planning shop. That's a litigation firm, the kind that corporations are terrified of. He looked up at her. Your grandmother didn't hire a lawyer to write a will, Miss Wexford. She hired a firm to win a war, and she paid them in advance to wait.
The senior partner of Marbury and Stone was a woman named Diane Marbury, and when Della gave the reference number to the receptionist on the 31st floor of a glass tower downtown, the response was not the polite delay she expected. The receptionist's eyes widened. She made a single call, and within 90 seconds, a tall woman in a charcoal suit came striding out of a corner office, stopped in front of Della, and looked at her with something close to wonder. You're her granddaughter, Diane Marbury said, the one who stayed. I'm Della Wexford. I know exactly who you are. Marbury's handshake was firm and dry. I've had a file on this matter sealed in my personal safe for 5 years. Mrs. Wexford retained this firm in person. She walked in here on her own 2 feet sharp, as anyone I have ever deposed. And she laid out a scenario in such precise detail that I half thought she was paranoid. A grim smile. And now her family has filed an emergency injunction claiming she was mentally incompetent within the week of your inheritance becoming known, exactly as she said they would, almost to the day. She gestured toward her office. Miss Wexford, I want to be very clear with you. I have been a litigator for 26 years. I have rarely, if ever, walked into a courtroom holding a hand this strong. Your grandmother did not leave loose ends. She left a noose, and she left it pre-tied, and your family has been kind enough to put their own heads through it. It is important to be honest about what happened next, because it would have been easy and false to say that a brilliant lawyer swept in and saved Della Wexford.
That is not what happened.
What happened is that Diane Marbury handed Della the file and the documentation and the legal architecture her grandmother had built, and then she made Della understand it. All of it. Because Vivian Wexford had left explicit instructions on that point too. The girl is to know everything. She is not to be a passenger in her own deliverance. She has carried this far enough blind. Let her see the whole of it, and let her be the one to drive it home. So Della learned. She sat in that office for 2 days, and she learned the law of irrevocable trusts and the standards for testamentary capacity, and the difference between an estate and the assets that were never part of one. She learned to read the documents she had been carrying, and piece by piece the full shape of what her grandmother had done rose up in front of her like a building she had drawn 1,000 times but never seen completed. It was the most extraordinary act of foresight she had ever encountered. 5 years ago, before the dementia,
Before the decline, while her mind was, as Marbury put it, ablaze,
Vivian Wexford had done 3 things quietly in a single carefully documented week. First, she had been examined by 3 independent physicians on the record who had each certified in writing that she was of completely sound mind. Not as a formality, as a defense. She had known even then that someday someone would claim she was mad, and she had built a wall of medical testimony against that day 5 years before it dawned. Second, she had placed the entire contents of the Beaumont strongbox, the platinum, the diamonds, the bonds into an irrevocable trust. Not part of the estate, not subject to the will at all in the way Royce believed. The trust named a single beneficiary with a single condition that the beneficiary be the family member who had remained personally and continuously at Vivian's side through the final years of her life. A condition that could be satisfied by exactly one human being on earth.
And third, and this was the part that made Diane Marbury's eyes gleam, she had separated the wheat
From the chaff with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 60 years in business and was not about to get sentimental at the end of it. Della did not fully grasp this last part until the morning of the hearing. None of them did. That was the point. The hearing was held in a wood-paneled courtroom downtown, and Della's family arrived like a procession of the entitled. Royce came in a bespoke suit, with his face already arranged into righteous outrage. Adrienne came clutching a designer handbag and dabbing at eyes that were not crying. The corrupt lawyer, Conrad Vane, came carrying a briefcase full of the half-truths he had spent his career perfecting. And Hollis came, too smiling, Hollis, who avoided Della's eyes, who had perhaps not yet realized that she knew. They had brought their own attorney, a sharp-jawed man named Pruitt, and he opened with confidence. "Your Honor," Pruitt began, "this is a simple matter. An elderly woman in the grip of advanced dementia, surrounded in her final months by a single relative, the respondent, Miss Della Wexford, who had unsupervised access to her documents, and her affections. We will show that Mrs. Wexford was not mentally competent to comprehend that she was bequeathing an asset worth tens of millions of dollars. We will show that this so-called inheritance was the product of confusion, manipulation, and undue influence. And we will ask this court to return the contents of the box to the primary estate where they rightfully belong. It was a good opening. It was the opening of a man who believed he held the stronger hand. Then Diane Marbury rose. "Your Honor," she said, "opposing counsel has built his entire case on a single load-bearing claim that Vivian Wexford
Was not of sound mind. I would like to address that claim first, because once it falls, nothing else they have brought you stands." And she dismantled it methodically in front of them all.
She entered the 3 physicians' certifications into the record dated 5 years prior, when not even Pruitt was claiming Vivian had been impaired. She called the first of those physicians, now retired, who testified that Vivian Wexford had been one of the most lucid and formidable patients he had assessed in 40 years of practice. She produced the documentation of the irrevocable trust signed and witnessed and notarized in that same clear-minded week,
Establishing beyond any argument that the contents of the box had been removed from the estate half a decade before Vivian ever grew ill. The respondent did not inherit these assets through the will at all, Marbury said. She received them through a trust established years before the decedent's mental decline began, a trust whose terms were fixed, witnessed, and medically vouched for long before opposing counsel claims any incapacity existed. There was no confusion. There was no manipulation. There was a brilliant woman in full possession of her faculties,
making a deliberate provision for the one grandchild who cared for her. The injunction is based on a premise that the documentary record annihilates. Della watched her brother's confidence begin to crack. But Diane Marbury was not finished. And here she paused and looked at Della, and the look passed a question between them. "Are you ready?" And Della gave a single small nod, because her grandmother had wanted her to be the one to land the final blow, and she would not let her down.
"Your Honor," Marbury said, "opposing counsel is so eager to claim the contents of that box for the primary estate that I feel compelled to make absolutely certain my client's brother understands what the primary estate actually contains." In the interest of full transparency, I would like to enter into the record the current financial position of the assets Mr. Royce Wexford inherited under the will. She handed a thick-bound folder to Pruitt and a copy to the judge. Royce snatched it. He flipped it open, and Della watched with a feeling she could not name as the righteous outrage drained out of her brother's face and was replaced by something gray and slack and disbelieving. "What is this?" Royce said. It was not a question. "That," said Marbury, "is the truth your grandmother prepared for you. The truth she knew you would never bother to look for because you were too busy looking at diamonds." Della understood it now, all of it, the final move her grandmother had made. Because Vivian Wexford had known her grandson. She had spent 36 years watching Royce reach for whatever glittered and turn his back on whatever required work. And so she had given him precisely what he would reach for, the things that looked valuable. The mansion, the portfolio, the Manhattan Tower, the trophies a man brags about at the country club. And every single one of them was hollow. The Manhattan commercial property, the crown jewel of Royce's inheritance, the tower worth tens of millions on paper, carried $80 million in environmental remediation liens. Decades of illegal chemical dumping by a former tenant. The Environmental Protection Agency had issued its cleanup mandate the week before Vivian died, and as the new owner, Royce was now personally liable for every dollar of it. The tower was not an asset. It was a sinkhole with a deed. The primary stock portfolio leveraged to the absolute hilt. Vivian had quietly taken out enormous undisclosed margin loans against it over the prior 3 years, funneling the money into a series of deliberately catastrophic offshore positions that existed for no purpose but to bleed the portfolio dry on a timer. The banks were calling the margins. There was nothing left to call. And the main line, mansion, the great Wexford estate, the symbol of everything, the family had been carried, 3 hidden mortgages, and was even now sliding into foreclosure. Royce had not inherited an empire. He had inherited the costume of one. A magnificent gilded rotting shell designed by a dying woman to look exactly like the thing he had always wanted. Right up until the moment it collapsed on top of him. "She ruined me," Royce whispered. He was looking at the folder, but he was not seeing it anymore. He pulled at his silk tie as though it were strangling him. I'm bankrupt. Worse than bankrupt. The liens alone." She didn't ruin you, Royce." The words came from Della. The courtroom turned to look at her because she had not spoken until now, and her voice was quiet, but it carried the way her grandmother's had always carried. She rose from her seat. She was wearing a plain navy suit that had replaced the rust-stained dress, and she stood straight, and she looked at her brother without hatred. And without triumph, only with a terrible level clarity. "She gave you exactly what you asked for," Della said. "You wanted the things that looked valuable from the outside. The titles, the address, the things you could photograph and post and brag about. You wanted the facade.
She took a breath. And you left the heavy, ugly, difficult thing to me. You wrapped it in rust, and you laughed, and you told me to throw it in the river. You couldn't be bothered to look closely at it, because looking closely is work, and you have never once in your life done the work. She turned to Adrienne, who was weeping now, real tears finally, as the architecture of her extravagant life dissolved in front of her. She knew you, Royce, Della said softly. She knew all of you. She spent her whole life learning to see through people, and at the end of it, she saw through you so completely that she could hand you your own destruction wrapped up like a gift, and know with absolute certainty that you'd be too greedy to ever notice. The room was silent. Then Conrad Vane made a small, fatal mistake. He stood attempting to regain control of a hearing that was hemorrhaging out from under his clients, and he said,
Your Honor, this is all very dramatic, but the question of the box's contents remains a matter of estate. On the subject of Mr. Vane, Diane Marbury said, and the temperature of her voice dropped 20 degrees. I have one final matter for the court. Vane went still. In assembling the documentary record, my firm reviewed every filing made on behalf of the Wexford estate, and we discovered that certain documents, specifically the trust instrument, removing the box's contents from the estate, and the physician's competency certifications, were in Mr. Vane's possession for the entire administration of this estate. He was the decedent's attorney. He held the file. She let that land. He knew the contents of that box did not belong to the estate. He knew Mrs. Wexford had been certified of sound mind. He had both of those documents in his own custody, and he concealed them from this court, from the beneficiary, and from his own duty in order to facilitate his client, Mr. Royce Wexford's claim. We have the correspondence. We have the time stamps. And we will be referring this matter to the disciplinary board and to the district attorney's office for the misappropriation of estate funds, which we have also documented. The judge dissolved the injunction within the hour. The contents of the Beaumont strongbox, the platinum, the necklace. The bonds were released fully and finally to Della Wexford as the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust, whose validity not even Pruitt could any longer pretend to contest. The family's claim collapsed completely. Royce sat motionless as his own attorney informed him in a low and urgent whisper that he could no longer afford to continue paying for representation. Della gathered her things to leave, and as she did, Hollis finally looked at her. He had said nothing the entire hearing. He had watched the whole structure come down around his cousin, and somewhere in the middle of it, he must have understood that his betrayal, the kindness he had faked, the information he had sold to Royce for a place at the winning table, had bought him nothing. The table was gone. He had sold his soul to back the losing horse, and now there was no prize, no reward, nothing but the knowledge of what he was. Della, he started. I never.
Don't, she said, not angrily, just finally. I know what you did, Hollis. You called me and you were kind to me when you knew exactly how alone I was. That's the part I'll never understand. Royce was just greedy. Greedy is simple.
Greedy is almost honest. But you looked at a person with nothing and you used the last thing she had. You used her loneliness. She picked up her bag.
She warned me about you, you know. Not by name, but she knew there'd be one of you. The one who smiles. She looked at him for a long moment. I hope it was worth what it cost you. Because it
Cost you everything, and you didn't even get the diamonds.
She walked out of the courtroom, and she did not look back. And behind her, her family sat in the wreckage of an empire that had never really existed. There was one more thing in the box that Della had not yet fully understood, and Diane Marbury explained it to her 3 weeks later in the calm of her office when the dust had settled and the world had stopped spinning. The bonds. Della had assumed they were simply more money, and they were a great deal of it. But they were also something else. Among the documents Vivian had sealed into that box beneath the bonds was a final instrument that Marbury had needed weeks to fully trace and verify. Decades ago, long before the rot set in Vivian Wexford had quietly carved out the one part of the family enterprise that genuinely worked. Not the trophy properties, not the leveraged portfolio, the actual functioning, profitable core of the business, a privately held shipping and logistics concern that had been the family's true engine all along, deliberately kept small and quiet and clean, hidden behind the gaudy facade of the rest. And the controlling interest in that company, the real Wexford legacy, the thing that actually generated wealth, rather than the things that merely displayed it, had been placed through the trust in Della's name.
She didn't just leave you a necklace, Miss Wexford, Marbury said.
She didn't even just leave you a fortune. She left you the business, the real one, the one that works. She separated the value from the vanity with surgical precision, and she gave the vanity to the people who craved it, and she gave the value to the only person she believed would protect it. Marbury studied her across the desk.
The question now is whether you want it. You're under no obligation.
You could sell the necklace, sell your interest in the company, and never work another day.
Many people would.
Della was quiet for a moment. She thought about the conservatory and the gray winter light and her grandmother's hand gripping hers. Character is what a person does in the dark when there's no reward in it. She thought about the folded acceptance letter still sitting in a drawer at the mainline house, the architecture program, the future she'd shelved at 23. She could go back to it now. She could do anything now. And she realized with a quiet certainty that surprised her that she did not want to disappear into ease. She had spent 5 years carrying something heavy because it was the right thing to do. And the muscle that habit had built in her did not simply vanish because the burden was gone. I want it, she said. The business. I want to run it properly. the way she would have. Diane Marbury smiled and slid a folder across the desk.
She thought you'd say that,
The lawyer said.
She left you a letter for this moment, too. The woman left letters for moments I haven't even discovered yet. I'm fairly sure she's still 3 steps ahead of all of us from the grave.
Della took the folder home to her real home. Now, not the cramped apartment above the laundromat which she had left without a single look back, but a modest place she had chosen for herself, light and clean and entirely her own. And there,
In the evening quiet, she opened the last letter her grandmother had left for her. My dearest Della,
if you are reading this, then you have done it. You have finished what I started, and more than that, you have chosen with the whole world finally open to you to keep working, to carry the real thing instead of cashing it in. I knew you would. I have known it since the day you turned down your school and moved into my cold and lonely house and never once let me see you cry. I owe you an apology, and I will not be alive to give it in person, so I give it here.
I made you carry an ugly thing for far too long without telling you what it was. I let your family wound you. I let them laugh at you, and I let you believe, even for a single night, that I had laughed with them. I did that because I had to be certain, not for my sake, but for the world's, that the person I trusted with everything could pass a test she did not know she was taking. You did. You always would have. I knew it, and I made you prove it anyway, and that was a cruelty, and I am sorry for it. Here is what I most want you to carry forward, my girl. Not the diamonds, not the company, even
Though I am glad you'll have it, I want you to carry the lesson the box taught you, because it is the truest thing I know.
the most valuable things in this world almost never look valuable. They come wrapped in rust and labor and inconvenience. They are heavy. They ask something of you before they will reveal what they are. And the people too lazy or too greedy or too frightened to do the work will look right at them and see only garbage and walk away every time. Your whole family looked at the most precious object in American history and saw a thing to throw in the river. And they looked at you, the most precious thing in my entire life, and saw the same. Do not become like them. Now that you have everything, do not start mistaking the shine for the substance. Find the heavy, ugly, valuable things. Do the work no one else will do. And someday, when you are old, find your own Della, the quiet one, the one who stays, the one everyone overlooks, and give her the chance no one but me ever gave you. You earned every brilliant facet of this, my sweet girl. Every single one. You earned it in the dark when no one was watching but me. With all my love and all my faith and all my pride. Grandmother Della read it twice, and then she
Set it down, and she walked to the window of her small, bright apartment, and she looked out over the rooftops of Philadelphia, the city going gold and pink in the falling evening light. The wait was gone now. not the memory of it that she would carry forever, and was glad to. But the crushing, daily grinding weight of the last 5 years had lifted, and what was left in its place was not lightness exactly. It was something better. It was the strength that only comes from having carried something heavy for a long time and never having set it down. On the table behind her sat a small velvet box. Inside it was a single pink diamond, one of the smaller stones from the Beaumont rose, which Della had kept for herself before sending the rest of the necklace to be displayed at last in the museum that had kept an empty plinth, waiting 70 years for its return. The diamond caught the last of the light and held it the way the platinum had, the way the truth always does in the end. Her grandmother had been right. Sometimes the most priceless treasures in the world are buried under layers of rust and ruin, ignored by everyone too proud to look closely, waiting only for the one person willing to do the heavy, thankless, unglamorous work of uncovering them. Della Wexford had been that person, and somewhere out there, she knew, in some cold and lonely house, there was another one, overlooked, underestimated, carrying a burden the world had told them was worthless. When the time came, Della intended to find them and to hand them a box of their own.